È stato un ottimo economista, un personaggio influente nella scienza economica, e I hope he rests in peace. I'm grateful to him because I had the chance to meet him in 2003, so some 20 years ago, in Benevento. Some friends and colleagues of mine, Professor Riccardo Alfonso, but also Professor Giuseppe Fontana, invited me and organized this event in Benevento in honor of Augusto Graziani, and then they edited a book where I contributed a chapter gratefully. And I met Augusto Graziani also after this meeting because he invited me and other colleagues, I mentioned some of them, to his own flat, his own apartment in Napoli. And we had a great dinner, and he presented his family to me, and I was really excited, and I still keep fond memories of this meeting because he was really a gentleman, a master in economic thinking, but also a very kind person with a lot of empathy also for those suffering from economic or social reasons. And I think his work deserves to be remembered, celebrated, and elaborated upon because I think that his theory of the monetary circuit gives us a very clear and essential understanding of what is money, where does money come from, and what are the factors that might drive economic growth or provoke a financial crisis. Quite sad when I remember Augusto Graziani as a person, because I met several economists during these last 30 years of my own career, but to be honest, very few, I think I can count them on a single hand. Very few economists have such a human nature, in a sense. They care about not just themselves, their own career, but they care about the people, especially the suffering individuals, because of the major problems that still affect our economic system. I think Augusto Graziani, more than many other so-called heterodox economists, was not a prima donna. He was not putting himself in the first forehand, but he was really trying to understand and improve the economic system in which we live, the capitalist or capitalism, financial capitalism nowadays. He was very deep and very open-minded. First time I've heard the name of Augusto Graziani, it was when I was at high school in the early 1980s, so some 40 years ago. I had a professor, Alvaro Cencini, who was my first professor in economics at high school level, and he then became professor at University of Lugano in Switzerland. And at the time, Alvaro Cencini was lecturing about both the French and Italian circuit theories, namely Augusto Graziani in Italy, but also Alain Pargues, Frédéric Poulin in France, but particularly Bernard Schmitt. Bernard Schmitt has coined this expression, the circuit theory of money, but then he was quite disappointed by how other circuit theorists elaborated on this theory, and he coined the expression quantum macroeconomics. So after my high school diploma, I then went to the University of Fribourg in the late 1980s, when Professor Bernard Schmitt was still there lecturing. And in the second part of my program, my master program, I attended his own lectures, and eventually he asked me to write a PhD, which I did from 1991 to 1996. I even became the research and teaching assistant of Professor Bernard Schmitt. And in this period, in the late 1980s, early 1990s, during my master and then PhD program, I read a lot of circuit theories, Augusto Graziani's in particular, because Professor Cencini gave me some hints, some papers that Augusto Graziani wrote in Italian, but also in English. And I became really fascinated by this approach, even though Schmitt and Graziani have not been agreeing on everything, because for Bernard Schmitt, there is a distinction between the circuit of money per se and the circuit of bank deposits, whereas for Augusto Graziani and other circuit theorists, money and bank deposits are synonymous expressions. But in spite of this disagreement on these essential points, both Augusto Graziani and Bernard Schmidt knew each other, and they were both gentlemen. In fact, this was a kind of community where we might have some disagreement, but still collaborate and agree about the essential way that we have to look at money, banks, and the payment system in general. I always quote Augusto Graziani's work in my own research works, but also in my own lectures as a professor of monetary economics at the University of Fribourg. Major points I would like to raise. The first is the fact that in Augusto Graziani's writings, one notices his deep and wide knowledge of the history of economic thought, the major scholars, not just Keynes, but lots of other authors, Karl Marx and Sraffa, and you name it. I think this is an essential point for all good economists within the academia, but also beyond it. One has to know the history of economic thought to understand that there is an evolution in this history, but also a pluralist approach that needs to be preserved, because otherwise students just know the mainstream theory in singular and not in plural. They believe that there is just one economic theory, one model, or one way of modelizing economic systems. And we noticed this gives rise to financial crisis, to climate change issues, to social riots because the labor market is depressed, and so forth. Augusto Graziani work shows that it is important to know the history of economic thought largely and deeply. And the second major point is the role of banks, not just in providing credit lines to any kinds of agents, but also to open the so-called monetary circuit, because if the circuit doesn't open, and this point was also pointed out by Riccardo Bellofiore in a number of his own writings, if the circuit of money doesn't open, well, then banks don't lend to firms, because firms don't want to borrow in order to produce more output, to hire more people, if there is a lack of so-called effective demand. I think that unemployment, as Augusto Graziani has shown, is not a voluntary decision, as neoclassical economics argues. It is involuntary unemployment that results from the fact that firms are reluctant in borrowing from banks, or banks are reluctant to lend to firms. And so if the circuit of money doesn't open, there is a number of people willing and able to work, but who are involuntarily unemployed. So I think Graziani's work has shown me that it is important to know the history of economic thinking, and also to understand that economic decisions, policy decisions, but also firms' decisions are essential for the so-called common good. And this is an important point I'm trying myself to put forward to my own students in my own research work. It is important because it is the economy stupid, namely all major questions have, or all major issues like wars, like climate change, like the pandemic crisis, the COVID-19, all these issues have an economic background, have a number of economic factors, not just the reason of health or power, or I don't know. It is the economy stupid, namely we have to look at the economic origins of climate change, social riots, wars, geopolitical tensions. And I think Augusto Graziani's work was really phenomenal in this perspective.